When people hear the word conflict, they usually think of a fight or an argument. They usually think of person versus person. So today I want to talk about how to write meaningful person versus person conflict. Whether we want to admit it or not, humans are social creatures, and socializing will inevitably lead to conflict. The important thing to remember is person versus person conflict doesn't always have to be some sort of spectacle, and it can involve more than two characters. If you hang on until the end of this video, I'll tell you how you can get a free character creation chart that will help you develop characters readers want to see in these conflicts. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. Let's start with who counts as person in person versus person conflict. When we talk about person versus person conflict in creative writing, person does not equal human. Person means any intelligent character in your story. So, in the Iron Druid Chronicles by Kevin Hearn, there is a dog named Oberon. Oberon is a side character who can communicate telepathically with the main character. He actively and intelligently participates in the story. This means he is no longer just a beast. He's not a part of nature. He counts as a person. So he is person versus person conflict. The same goes for the car Hellbringer in It Happened One Doomsday by Lawrence McNaughton. This car is possessed by a demon, and it thinks and acts intelligently. That means that when it creates conflict, it's not person versus technology or nature. It is person versus person. In science fiction, things like aliens are often person versus person. So, person versus person conflict doesn't mean human versus human. It means human versus intelligent being, or intelligent being and versus intelligent being. Also, it doesn't have to be individual versus individual. Some people will separate person versus person into individual versus individual and individual versus society. I think of them as one and the same type of conflict. It just happens to be more people on one side than the other. So, person versus person could be individual versus a group versus an individual, or a group versus a group. A great example of this is the Star Wars books and movies. Yes, Star Wars is more than the movie franchise. It has a lot of books. There are things like Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader, person versus person, individual versus individual. Then we have Luke Skywalker versus a bunch of clones. Well, that's person versus group. And finally, we have the Rebel Alliance versus the Empire, group versus group. So you can have different levels of person versus person conflict within the same story. That's what we mean when we say person versus person. Next, I want to cover what are meaningful person versus person conflicts. Person versus person is external because it is your character facing a force outside of themselves. The nice thing about person versus person conflict is it's very visual, so it translates well to other mediums, including film and TV. I also find it easy myself to come up with person versus person conflicts because of that visual nature. It's easy for me to imagine in my head. But the important thing to remember when it comes to person versus person is it doesn't always have to be some big spectacle, and having a fight scene just for the sake of a fight scene is not good enough. It needs to have an impact on your story. A fight scene for the sake of a fight scene is just an event. An event is not necessarily plot. Plot means that you have events happening that are tied together and that are leading into each other. Sometimes we will add person versus person conflict because it's exciting and we had this great idea, but it doesn't actually impact the story or the characters. In that case, it can actually slow down the pace of your story because it's really fluff. It's not actually driving your plot forward or inspiring character growth. So when you're creating person versus person conflict, make sure it's having a meaningful impact on your story. We do this by making sure there are consequences. It's usually the consequences in person versus person that create the meaning, that make it impact the story. Here's an example of that from my book, When Magic Calls. This is an excerpt from the short story, Bones of the Soul. "You lazy ass, good-for-nothing runt." Tahoma's mother screamed from the kitchen doorway, "Where's my bottle?" Spittle flew from her mouth as she grasped the wall to steady herself. Despite her infrequent meals, Mrs. Begay carried substantial weight on short legs and was prepared to use it to return to her perpetual buzz. "You drank it already." Tahoma stood up from the kitchen table. His chair rocked back and forth slightly on uneven legs as his blood turned hot with rage. All he wanted was to eat his dinner in peace. He glared at his mother but kept his distance. Though taller, Tahoma's body showed his lack of nutritious meals, no padding to absorb blows. "Liar," she screamed. Tahoma downed the last bit of milk and added the bowl and spoon to the pile of dishes in the sink. "I didn't take your damn booze," he said, trying to keep the venom of hate out of his words. In this scene, we have two characters arguing over what happened to a bottle of alcohol. Now, it might not be clear from this small excerpt, but this interaction is what sparked Tahoma to leave home. This was the final straw. He leaves after this. So because of this person versus person conflict, he makes the decision not to return home that night or ever. So this is the catalyst for him to change his life. On the surface, this person versus person argument might not seem like it's that meaningful to the overall plot, but because of the consequences of the argument, it is. That's how it's meaningful instead of just fluff. Another way to create meaningful person versus person conflict is to look at what's motivating your characters and make them at odds with one another. So, for example, your protagonist might be trying to feed his family because they're starving, and your villain might be motivated by greed. So the hero is motivated to save his family, the villain is motivated to just have more. Those motivations put them at odds with one another and are going to be what makes that conflict meaningful, because at that point it's not just conflict for conflict's sake. There are motivations behind the conflict, and the outcome is going to impact the story and the characters. You can also look at political parties, castes, class systems, other societal groups, and put those at odds with one another to create conflict. This could lead to changes within the whole society. When you're creating person versus person conflict, remember this one can be easy to accidentally turn into fluff, to make it so it doesn't have an impact on the story and therefore isn't meaningful. So, to prevent that, take a look at your person versus person conflict and ask yourself what is motivating your characters to participate in that conflict and what the consequences of that conflict are going to be. How are those consequences going to drive your plot forward or inspire your characters to grow and change? That's going to be what takes your person versus person conflict from fluff to meaningful events in your story. I want to leave you with an editor and author's tips for thinking about person versus person conflict. When you're coming up with ideas for your person versus person conflict, try not to equate it to violence. It doesn't have to be a fist fight or an argument. Person versus person doesn't have to have malice behind it. Competition is a great way to think about this. You can have characters competing at a sporting event. That might be group versus group. You can have two people up for the same job promotion, or two teenage girls who both want to be prom queen. Their conflict might not be malicious, but it's still person versus person. Also, think about misunderstandings. If the person versus person conflict is created because of a misunderstanding, now that can be more interesting, and it can show that the characters aren't necessarily being mean-spirited, they're just having a miscommunication happening. For example, when two characters first meet, they could make assumptions about each other that turn out to be wrong. So they might not treat each other very nicely, or they might do things differently at first before they get to know one another. And then once their assumptions are challenged and proven wrong, they have to adjust their behavior. And that can be what ends that person versus person conflict. So person versus person doesn't always have to be some big spectacle or battle. It can be competition and it can be misunderstanding. Regardless, remember, meaningful person versus person is going to drive your story forward and have an effect on your characters, and usually that comes from the consequences. So, what do you think of first when you hear person versus person conflict? Share it in the comments below. And for more videos on conflict and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. That's where you will find your character creation chart, which will help you develop characters that readers want to see in these conflicts. And if you want to see how I do this, go to caitlinburvey.com. That's where you will find my book, When Magic Calls, which has the short story Bones of the Soul in it. And now it's your turn to use person versus person conflict to drive your story forward, to inspire character growth, to keep your pace up, and to ignite your ink.